We'll be live in YouTube in about 15 seconds, which happens to be now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome and thank you for joining us to the Terraform community office hours for the AWS provider. I'm joined today by Simon Davis and Angie Pinilla. But before we get to introductions, a quick word on our code of conduct. In essence, be welcoming, be inclusive, and be friendly. This is a professional environment. So essentially, just be an excellent version of yourself. It's Thursday, and that's the kind of feeling that we want to have going into the weekend. So help us make that happen. So my name is Kerim Satirli. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp, where I focus on Terraform and Packer lately. And I'm joined today by Simon Davis, engineering manager for the AWS provider, and Angie Pinilla, who's a software engineer for the AWS provider. Welcome, you two.
Thanks, Kerim. Glad to be here.
So this is super exciting for me because a year ago, I had the first edition of the office hours with two other people from your team, but still the AWS provider. And it's been a wild ride in the past year. Back then, it was still 2.50 something, I think. 3.x came out in summer. Upgrading was super nice. I remember, we all had that feeling from 0.11 to 0.12 in terms of Terraform. Much rougher than going from 2x to 3x. So thank you for that. And on the topic of releases, 2 releases this week. Super cool. Normally, just on Thursdays, right?
Yeah, we try to be consistent and do Thursday afternoons.
So the one thing that really stuck out this week with yesterday's release, Apprunner support on day 1. That is good timing. How does that, so as somebody who's been using the AWS provider, pretty much it was the first one I used ever with Terraform. I'm curious, how does it happen that we get day 0 or day 1 support for a resource?
Sure. Actually, yesterday was actually a joint release for predictive scaling, which is a kind of new sort of machine learning powered auto scaling configuration. And it was just actually the day before we did Apprunner support. So this week has been busy. So we've had 2 special releases, but generally we have a pretty good relationship with AWS. We have great context on their partner team, and we also have a direct contact with a lot of their service teams, who will tend to let us know what their sort of vague roadmap sort of looks like in the next quarter or 2. And they'll often kind of come to us and kind of ask for launch day support for usually their bigger launches. We can't always support them, but we do try and do where we can. And so what tends to happen is, close-ish to the date, we'll kind of get some sort of preview. We'll get preview access to the service. We'll get preview documentation, and we kind of do the integration ahead of time. And then for some of these, they just kind of quietly come out as sort of launch day support. But for some of these, we do kind of have a blog post and kind of do a bit of marketing as well. And then on launch day, we just basically look out for the public Go SDK to get released with that little bit of functionality. Then we raise a public PR and merge it into the provider, and then release.
So much behind the scenes goodness happening. I love it. It's honestly really cool. I remember seeing this a couple times, especially at reInvent. Something new gets announced, and for me, it was always, if it's not in Terraform, I'm not going to really use it because I'm not somebody who likes the graphical UI and clicking things, because I know I'm going to mess it up the 3rd time I'm trying it. And being able to codify it is much nicer. So thank you for adding that in there. In my excitement with all the new releases happening, completely forgot introductions. So, Angie, let's start with you. How long have you been at HashiCorp?
Yeah, that's a good question. A little over a year now. I started March of 2020. Yeah.
Pandemic start. I love it.
The same with me. So I was March 23rd, I think, and I think the week I started was also the week. I think the Sunday before my first day at HashiCorp. I got an email from our daycare saying they were closing. So that was an interesting first week.
Yeah, I think it's been a bit more normal at this point, but you know, eventually we're going to get back to having actual face-to-face meetings. I'm excited for the first community office hours we can run in a physical space and just have a couple people chatting around. And we don't have to joke about the green room. We can actually have a green room. If you're watching this,
so I guess the three of us all kind of started around the same time. So we've all had this wild first year ride together.
Yeah, it's definitely been interesting, but in a good way, I think, because despite our disconnectedness of, like physically separate, we're still, I talk to most people multiple times a week, and it's nice to be able to move things forward like that and actually, have some fun. And I'm glad that you two are joining us for the first time this time around. Obviously, that means you'll have to be repeat viewers because there's a record held by 2 other AWS folks.
Yeah.
And we're going to have some fun with that. In the meantime, we've got some questions coming in. And I think the first one is not AWS specific, but we'll answer it still. Alden Jenkins asks, how can I use Terraform for my home lab? And actually, I can answer that because I just moved and I use the Terraform provider, AWS provider, to set up part of my home lab, which is, I have a lot of Synology stuff that I back up locally, but having had bad data loss, I also like having some stuff in S3. So that's where Terraform comes in. Other things you might want to look at if you're building a home lab is the Ubiquity provider. The Docker provider would be a good one if you're doing stuff with that. If you're running a Kube cluster, there's definitely options. And if you want to go further than just Terraform, run a local Nomad cluster or Vault and have some fun with that. So there's a ton of options. Can pretty much bring all of our tools in. And then when you're building stuff for your home lab, you'll eventually be ending up with a ton of resources. If there's one thing that I'm super excited about that we finally have for 3 weeks now, is default tags. So Angie, do you want to take us through the process of that and help us explain a little bit what it is?
Yeah, sure. So default tags is this concept of pretty much tagging AWS resources, but from the provider level. So with people that are used to using Terraform with the AWS provider, they're generally putting up a block somewhere in their config file where they're saying provider AWS and putting some other metadata within there. So now they have the ability to put in a specific block called default tags. And then within that, there's another block called tags itself. And it's very familiar to what the tags block or map kind of looks like in other resources that you may use across a provider. And there you would essentially write the tags that you're interested in using. And those are the tags that you essentially want to propagate to all the resources that you're managing with Terraform, as opposed to what we've come to find out that users generally, sometimes they use locals, variables, or cluster configurations, which is definitely a fantastic way to do it, but this kind of simplifies it and makes configurations a little bit more readable, a little bit more manageable, a little bit more dry in that sense. And so essentially, it does require some refactoring for individuals that may want to use this. But the hope is that after kind of putting in that work, then moving forward, kind of sharing the tags that you're interested in across your resources should be, in essence, a little bit easier. And so it isn't too much other than that, other than, kind of moving that tags concept from the resource level up to the provider. And then if you're interested as well, I mean, we haven't taken away the resource level tagging. If anything, we're just appending what we call the default tags to what you may already be using in your resource. So you can even add more tags on top of what you may have already put in your resources. So yeah, since version 3.38, we've made it available to essentially all resources, with the exception of auto-scaling groups, because they are their own, I guess, flavor in their own right. The tags use different attributes, unfortunately. And I think it's getting a little loud back here, I'm sorry.
I think the call out to, like some people using locals, I'm definitely one of those, because, you do what you need to do to get it done. And tagging is important. If you're a small startup, maybe, like if you're the only operations engineer, it doesn't really matter, but eventually you'll have multiple environments. I love being able to just define, hey, all these resources have these X default tags, rather than define them in my module, which if it works, it's great. But if I forget it in the module, it means that all the resources I built with that module lose it. It's great to have it on the highest possible level, or I guess the lowest possible level, depending on how you look at it from your infrastructure. So super good feature. We shared a link to the blog post in the chat. So if you're reading along and asking questions, note that down for later. And we'll also have some documentation for the default tags on how to use them. The ability to combine them is really nice. Just being able to say environment and maybe cost center, as a random example, should be on all resources, and they are set based on your basic provider connection, and just a nice feature.
I thought it might be nice to kind of expand and kind of just say how this feature kind of came to be within the provider. Like we even though the provider team is fully staffed by HashiCorp, we do run this as very much an open source project. So the community is always number one when we're prioritizing things. Default tags was probably, I think it's actually our second most requested issue of all time. So more than 500 upvotes. So the way this worked internally is our product manager wrote a kind of what we call a PRD, which kind of outlines the kind of goals of this, and talk to customers, try to get their use cases, see if the solution would fit that. Once this was kind of approved from a product point of view, Angie wrote what we call an RFC, or request for comment. So this kind of takes the PRD and kind of describes the technical implementation of it. And then that gets kind of circulated internally for review. And then once that's okay, we posted our proposed solution publicly on GitHub. And then we kind of moved to implementation. So I think so most of the work here, I think, was very much in the research and sort of design of this. And the actual implementation didn't actually take that long. But due to the nature of the implementation, we did have to update basically every single resource file in the provider. So luckily we did some, one of the engineers that was on the team was quite handy with semgrep, and so wrote some pretty neat semgrep rules to kind of go through our code base and automatically make the changes we needed, which was very cool. I was pretty surprised how well it worked. It didn't get it right all the time, but it worked really well. Yeah, I just thought that a little more context of how the thing works.
I think that's actually a brilliant call out. And in chat, we'll share a link to the works.hashicorp.com site where we talk about our writing culture, including how to write PRDs and RFCs, or how we write them. It's not necessarily the only way, but it's definitely our way. And I've come to appreciate that, if you spend, like you said, you spend a lot of time writing and refining the idea, and it crystallizes that path forward that you should take. And it makes implementation so much easier. But it's also, if you're joining, 3 years down the road, and you might go like, why did we do default tags like that? there's a document that outlines why. And that to me is just amazing.
I also like the way, because I like when you're looking at them from a historical point of view, usually the comments are still there. So you kind of get this point of time sort of view of people's, because, that might change. If that RFC came out 2 years later, it may have had a completely different reaction. And it's just kind of nice to see that historical reaction as a point in time thing.
It is, yeah, it is exactly that. It's just, back then, let's say, 3 years down the road, we realize that, hey, this was not the best approach, but at least we can follow people's ideas. And that is such a force multiplier in understanding why a choice was made the way it was made. It's, it is an amazing feature. We had a couple of ambassadors actually go like, hey, default tags, super amazing, Apprunner support on day one. And also now in the chat, people really appreciate that work. So as somebody who still uses the AWS provider 5 out of 7 days a week, let me tell you, day one support, people appreciate it. We know it, AWS knows it, but it's always good to remind, the people that actually build it, that your work is used. So if
I kind of wish I was still a Terraform practitioner and writing configurations so I could use it too.
I mean, it's never too late to do some stuff. Like there's plenty of side projects where, for me, even when I do like a basic thing that I'm building, that I will never touch again, I will still codify it first because of all the benefits. And like it doesn't interrupt my workflow anymore. Like I'm comfortable around these tools. And so it's nice to be able to go forward with that. In the meantime, we've got a couple of questions from our audience. Specifically, I have an AWS IAM role policy which references a file, a JSON file for the policy value. And the file has a var VPC name in it. And I'm wondering if there's a way to evaluate the TF var in there. That's an interesting one. So you're using the file function to load your policy.json. And in there, you have the variable for VPC name. And you're wanting to evaluate that. So my brain says, I'll let Angie answer that one if you have an idea.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you wrap it with quotes, I think it does the evaluation. I know there's definitely some documentation on this. I could send it to you, Kerim. It's under expression mapping. I know there's an example there that they reference they reference a resource. I don't know if it's similar idea there. They wrap it and then that gets evaluated. But going from the question, I don't know if the user already attempted that. Yeah, see, this is one of the things where not being a practitioner, you lose those skills there. But hopefully that's the right ballpark.
I have to say, I've actually never used expression mapping myself in this way. So this is actually super cool. This was educational for me, and based on the astonished face emoji from Alden Jenkins in chat, who asked the question, this, might have been astonishing for more than one person here. So that's good. Beautiful. And if this didn't answer your question, feel free to follow up in chat. If you're joining us today, we're doing the AWS Community Office Hours. So if you have questions for the AWS team, shoot, and we'll do our best to answer them for you, usually with helpful links. See, the answer you gave, Angie, about this random function in Terraform, and it's not random because JSON is a fairly common one, but there's so many functions that do so much cool stuff that it's almost impossible to know about all of them. So great call out.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think if you play around with the Terraform console, I think sometimes you kind of learn what functions are out there. But yeah, if you don't use them day to day, I'm sure you could easily miss one like this.
Easily, which makes me wonder, what's your favorite function? Which one gets you the most value out of Terraform?
Um, I think actually that file function is really helpful because it's great that it'll just read it in as a string or what you need it as. Maybe hopefully it's not underrated.
I think file is a super useful one. Simon, when you still use Terraform, more often than not, what was your favorite function or favorite feature of Terraform that you think people should know?
I'll be honest, I'm mostly management overhead at this point, but I know my last job, my favorite was destroy. Mostly because I was very much involved in cost savings and trying to like make sure our cloud costs were kind of under control given sort of account spread, resource spread. And so kind of being able to automate that and try to, wind things down using cloud custodian, things like that, destroy whole setups it still gets me every time. It's just amazing to kind of, no matter how complex something is, you just issue that command and it's forgotten, it's all gone.
It definitely pays spades also for your career to shut down infrastructure you're not using, right? It's
especially long forgotten about instances in a random region that have been there for 5 years.
Those EBS volumes, the 200 that nobody has ever touched, and you're wondering like, why can I not start a new EC2 instance? I have nothing running. Oh, because my EBS limit is reached. Got it. It does happen. James Kelly gave a shout out for the JSON encode function in the chat. Also a good one. And Angie, you said console, which technically isn't a function. It's more, well, I mean, it's a function on its in a different way. But if you're doing rapid development with Terraform and you have never used a console, definitely give that one a try. It is so nice to just be able to type out the function, not having to do plan and apply for everything, and just be able to figure out, hey, what's the structure of that? Let's say you start an EKS cluster. You get a lot of outputs back. And with a console, it's easy to pick what you need or don't need even. Which brings me to my next question. What's your favorite function to work on? Sorry, service, Angie.
My favorite service. I guess my first service that I think I worked on was WAF, not the classic one, but I guess what they call the new WAF or WAF v2. That was the first thing I worked on joining the providers. So I think I've definitely enjoyed not only just doing, I guess, things on my own, but reviewing other people's work on it and seeing that service develop as it has. That's been a lot of fun.
WAF v2 is definitely, it's an amazing service. And while we haven't used v2, we've definitely used v1 a lot. It's a nice way to keep out connections that you don't want your application to be visiting. That's definitely a good one. Simon, any feature that comes to mind that makes you go like, hey, this was a really cool one?
I don't tend to like do these implementations and I don't get to play with AWS that much anymore, but I kind of like where things like Apprunner are going. They're kind of just reducing things down to something very simple and kind of taking a lot of overhead over people's plates. There's been so many kind of like attempts at this, and there's still quite a lot of still, I think a lot of people when they're production environments kind of like want more control. But I'd be really kind of like prefer to roll their own for a lot of these things. But it'd be really neat to kind of see something like this take off, and kind of just be something that is there running mission critical systems, and it is very much managed for you, that whole process.
Yeah,
it'd be neat.
Especially if infrastructure is not, like, maintaining infrastructure is not your core business, because, you know, like, you're a very small team, everyone is a full stack developer, which means you're probably light on operational engineering. Realistically, you know, like, sure, it sounds like a stereotype, it probably is, but maybe it really isn't. Do you really want to spend the time maintaining that service, or do you just want somebody to do it for you? I mean, I know the answer for myself. Alden followed up with a pretty cool question, which is, what can we expect coming soon from the AWS provider? And so I'm curious, let me preface this question by asking, 2x ended pretty much last summer. 3x came in June, July, something like that. When is 4x coming?
Well, we don't have any like hard rules on this, but we are aiming for each sort of year to 18 months to have a major version. So we are sort of planning, a major release this year. And the major release tends to be our only opportunity to kind of throughout the year to do deprecations or make breaking changes. We obviously try not to, but sometimes they're just in the best interests of the long-term health of the provider. In this particular major release, we're looking at S3 in particular. We have a number of issues that are some of our most top upvoted issues, which are basically asking us to refactor the S3 resource and maybe break it up a little bit to something a bit more manageable. I mean, it's certainly one of the oldest resources, and S3 as a service has just been added to and added to and added to. And even on the AWS side, there's 2 separate S3 APIs. So I think it's probably about time that maybe we give this one a refactor. So this is something that I think Angie is lined up to do. Like I said before, I think in this point of view, we kind of skipped the product side of the PRD step, but we're going to go to the kind of RFC step where Angie will be kind of looking into how we can break up the S3 resource into something easier to manage for us and easier to use for practitioners. There's also some smaller issues, like if you go to our GitHub repository, there's a V4, I think it's a V4 milestone, and in there we tend to mark issues where we want to solve them, but we know that solving them will be a breaking change for many users, so that you can kind of get an idea. That bucket doesn't represent what we'll actually do, but we're likely to do most of those alongside that S3 refactor. Long term, I think we're probably going to try and make this a feature of each major release have a wholesale refactor if required, if asked for by the community for some of these major services. I think S3 is one of the ones where people are asking for a pretty major overhaul. But there's definitely some where we don't need a major overhaul, at least at the external interface side. But the internal could definitely do with a big looking at, and maybe refactor internally. Something like Elasticache is one of those ones which is pretty troublesome for us to work with, and we spent a lot of time this year already on it, and I think we could sink a bunch more into making Elasticache easier to use. As far as things like default tags, there's nothing, I guess, on our like provider functionality wise specific on our roadmap for the immediate term. Team wise, we are spending time now looking at just making it easier to contribute. So that's adding more linters, more semgrep rules, trying to automate and make it easier to contribute. So that's something we're spending. There's a few different aspects we're looking at where we can try and make that easier. Where the team has kind of got to a point now where we're just about able to kind of keep up with the volume of incoming issues and PRs, and In the last quarter, we actually closed more than were added, which I mean, it's a big step. It's a big thing for us, but and hopefully we can keep that going. I think in the last quarter, I think we got something like, I think it was 3,000 opened PRs. I think it was. I'm trying to find it. I did have the exact number somewhere. I'm sorry, no, that's all right. No, it's yeah, in the quarter it was 850 PRs were raised and 950 were merged. So we're on the right side of that number. So, but like I think a lot of this was us increasing the size of the team, but a lot of this was a lot of the work that our team has done over the last year, writing linters and making it easier for PRs to land on our plates, in a good shape. So we don't have to like comment on nitpicky things. Like these are all kind of done for us, or stylistic ones.
And that is a decent amount of PRs, and the good thing is that the amount being merged is actually like 10-15% more than being added. So that's good for the people that.
Other thing is we are hiring, so hit that apply button.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how many people are actually on the team?
Right now we have 5 engineers, and then myself as manager and Mary as product manager.
I mean, the release speed is almost breakneck. I mean, especially 2 releases this week. It's I'm impressed with how much 5 people get to do with the right support around them. So Angie, I'm curious, if let's say I want to add a resource that's not there yet, or maybe I see an open issue for something, what's the best way for me to add a PR? Like, I know we've documented this a little bit, but I'm curious, what would you say I should do or should not do?
Yeah, sure. I think always when contributing, you kind of should have an idea of kind of what the task is. Like, are you updating some documentation? Sometimes we have issues there and people contribute that way. That's probably one of the easiest way to contribute, actually. If you see any type of like actual error in our documentation that's in the registry, or maybe we missed something, that's a really clear way to go download our repo locally, make an edit in the documentation, and then push that up. That's usually pretty self-explanatory. But I think, of course, yeah, when you're going to contribute, kind of get an idea, as you said, are you planning to do a new resource? Are you fixing a bug? Kind of get that context in your mind so that you can go to our repository and then go through our contributing guidelines. And there should be, in theory, some links that kind of walk you through the different types of checklists, depending on the type of contribution you're making. So if, for example, in your example, you're doing a new resource, there should be some guidance around how to do that. If it's fixing a bug, maybe there's some guidance there. Internally, we have even talked about hopefully, expanding this to some Learn tutorials in the future. That's something we've talked about, but haven't approached just yet. But maybe that could be another way to make contributing a little bit easier for everyone. If there's a more, I guess, kind of planned out way to do it. But yeah, the best way to do it is always to approach our contribution guidelines. But I understand that it can be quite hefty. It's a lot to read through. I know myself, I definitely can cut corners when I read. So I think what we always advise is just not to be scared to ask either. So you can go through a repository, plenty of individuals contribute, and sometimes we have first-time contributors, and we're happy to help those contributions along, and we're happy to answer questions as well.
I think even just reviewing a few of the contributions that I've seen, community people reach out and go like, hey, I'm really curious about this PR. Do we have any insights in this? And the amount of time we spend in making sure, your contribution actually makes it is, I love seeing that. We give, and when I say we, I mean you, obviously, give good feedback on the PR. You show people, hey, you might be missing default tags because maybe you started your PR, 4 weeks ago and it was only added 3 weeks ago. So it is cool how welcoming this is, and we shared the link to the contributing MD in chat for the people that are interested. And if you're interested in making this a full-time thing, contributing to the AWS provider, then that's also cool. Keep checking our job site, and maybe you'll find something there. Maybe you'll make it onto one of these streams and we can talk about what you did in your first half year. Who knows? Also, we're getting a shout out to from Alden saying, so cool to hear that S3 is being a priority. And yeah, I can see that, like S3 from 2008 is definitely not S3 from 2021. It's in name only. Like all the things that were added, it's yeah, I can see why you would want to change that up.
I mean, we do have this sort of concept of core services that is kind of on our repo, and those are ones we are paying special attention to, and they're the ones that we know that changes to will, negative experience within those core services is going to have a big blast radius for our users. So those are the ones we try to schedule in some refactor time so we can kind of give those services a holistic view and kind of just see where people are having the most trouble. Yeah, I think when I think it's 3 of your top 5 are telling you need to break up the S3 resource, I think it might be time to break up the S3 resource.
I can see how that would be valuable feedback. I think one thing that Angie mentioned, but we should repeat, is if you think about contributing documentation and you feel like, well, like I'd rather contribute a resource because that's much cooler. It is, hands up. Like if you're able to add something like wavelength zones, super cool. But if you're able to change documentation and help the team out by adding a tiny change that, maybe corrects a variable that doesn't actually default to true, that's a huge change, because everyone who uses that resource will be able to benefit from that because it's going to be in the documentation. So, as a former colleague Tracy used to say, documentation is just as valid a contribution as anything else. And I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist remains the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do try to get every documentation PR in where we can, because they're often the easiest ones to review. We know that, we do have, like, what is it today? 560 open PRs. So we obviously did with 5 of us, like we're not going to get to them all in any short period of time. So we know that some people are going to be waiting for quite some time probably to look at those PRs, but those smaller PRs like documentation are still hugely valuable, and they're very easy for us to kind of get in.
And as with any project, scratch your own itch. If it annoys you that something has the wrong default value, probably annoys somebody else, but not everyone might have your skill level. Somebody else might just come to this resource for the first time and might go like, well, it doesn't actually default to true. So it's a good fix. In the meantime, if you're joining us now, we're doing community office hours with the AWS team. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll answer them for you. And in the meantime, the contributing guide, we shared that. Super, super nice document. I remember that being added sometime last year. It is just so nice. And even if you look at how the repository itself, the Terraform providers AWS repository, evolved over time. Simon, you mentioned, like adding linters and everything just to make the contributing experience better. That there's a lot of thought going into that. Obviously, we benefit from that, but everyone else who writes PRs does as well. So I'm curious.
Absolutely, and we want to merge as many as we can. I mean, we would love to go press merge on all 560 PRs, but you know, the thing that our team really tries to safeguard is consistency. So it doesn't matter what resource you pick in the AWS provider, it should work like any other resource you pick. And we know from experience that's kind of a hard thing. That consistency is kind of a hard thing to put in documentation, and it's kind of a hard thing for new contributors to get the first time around. So that's why we pay very close attention to the operation of new resources and how they work, just so that practitioners have a Terraforming experience, no matter what resource they choose, that there isn't like one that behaves strangely and has, you know, dragons within as much as possible. So yeah, and we know that when we get that wrong, and we do get that wrong sometimes, people complain, and where we do get that wrong, we get a lot of issues raised because this doesn't behave like others, and people will either think it's a bug or people will think we just got the design wrong, and they're right. So that's kind of why it might seem like we're quite slow, or when we do PR reviews on resources, that we can be quite picky on things like design, and that's really the reason, is just so that all the resources are consistent and they work the same.
I like to think of it as, you know, going to a fine dining restaurant. You want the same experience every time when you order that resource, you know, and that resource is just going to be your meal. And you don't want it to be, you know, like misaligned or not actually having half the components that you need or half the outputs. And I think the slowness might be perceived, but at the same time, I mean, sure, you know, you might have found a GitHub issue and you clicked watch and, you know, nothing happens for half a year. But maybe that's because it is such a special case. I remember one from probably a year ago by now, which was about bringing your own IP block. Not an easy to build for use case. So it might take us a while to actually get the right setup on our side. So as you interact with us in those issues, also keep in mind that not just are real humans writing the software, real humans are also reading those issues. So, you know, let's keep it friendly. And I'm not calling out anyone specifically because that's not the point here, but it is good to think, you know, like if you're frustrated with the software, that's valid. It happens. We're trying to build software that's useful, but share it with us in a way that's also good. And, you know, like where the next day when you reread how you wrote it, you don't go like, "Ooh, I shouldn't have said that." It's generally not what you want.
I think generally we have our community is pretty awesome, and we have a lot of people contributing, and with almost, it's very few people are kind of not abiding by the code of conduct. It's generally pretty positive. But, you know, we definitely empathize with people being frustrated that their PRs aren't being merged. And it's just, we have to, if you have that many, we have to rank them some way, and then we generally rank them in upvotes effectively. So we're going to always try and be working on the ones that the top sort of 20, 50 in a quarter, try to get them out if we can.
Think, yeah, as somebody who uses a provider, I prefer consistency over as many features as possible. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? So we had a couple new people join us. Hey, Tom, nice to see you again. Amit is asking if you can use, can I get Lambda with AWS source code with Terraform? Trying to interpret that question because it doesn't immediately ring a bell for me, but I mean, you can provision a lot of different Lambda resources with Terraform, which is actually super cool. Yeah.
I just want to give a shout out to the Lambda team at AWS because they've been really great at contributing to the provider. Often sort of ahead of, often for a product launch on Lambda, they're often kind of will come to us with some PRs, which is just super awesome to see.
Kind of partnership sounds like, I mean, it's beneficial for both parties, right? And for everyone involved, because it's not just somebody from their side and somebody from our side. It eventually makes it into a public release, which means everyone can use it. Which makes me wonder, so, you know, you obviously built for all the public zones, US East 1 through, you know, AP Northeast 1. How does the team deal with GovCloud and other things?
Well, we do basically have one engineer on our team who's kind of specialized in sort of public sector zones. And so most recently this year, when he first started, he basically had to fix the acceptance test suite, because the acceptance test suite was just really not designed to cope and maintained to cope with the little differences that you'd find in GovCloud. So that literally took months of Dirk's time, but he got through all these tests. And so now I think we have something like 5,000 acceptance tests now. And you know, with 5,000 acceptance tests, you're probably never going to have a green build, possibly. But it's very, very low, our failures. And now our GovCloud and commercial, they're about equal. So, you know, we can kind of now say that, like, we have pretty much full support for GovCloud. Well, where our coverage overlaps with GovCloud. And then the next thing is kind of secret and top secret. And so those regions have their own kind of, because they're air gapped, are difficult to get access to. But that is something we're looking at, because we want, if you are air gapped, it should still work, and we do want it to work. So we are kind of have that person sort of dedicated to that problem.
Yeah, being air gapped does make it difficult to get to them by design. You don't want to be in the air gapped environment that ends up on the front page of some publication.
No,
because it
but
was
I mean,
not
it's not just government as well. We do have customers that run their Terraform enterprise air gapped with completely air gapped environments. So it all does work now. We spend a lot of time both on the enterprise side and on the provider side to make sure that does work.
Which is actually a perfect lead into my next question. We have a couple of Outpost resources, data sources. What are our plans for going deeper into Outposts? The service, no. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the, when I first started, the Outpost team was one of the first teams that we kind of worked quite closely with. And we were able to kind of do launch support for a number of Outpost features. And it was kind of neat because we did get to play with an Outpost. And so we do try and keep up, but you know, as they add things to Outposts, we not necessarily always able to support it. And it's not easy. We have to make sure we get access to that lab so we can actually make sure it definitely works. But it is a very neat thing to get to play with, and it's just nice that they're expanding the different types of Outposts and expanding the features. But if there is Outpost stuff that is missing, just hit the upvote button and let us know.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, the original Outpost was, I think, a full rack or half a rack, but I remember seeing an announcement somewhere that smaller sizes are going to be announced for like 1 and 2 unit high things. So I can see many more companies, you know, finding an interest in that, if that's a use case. Either way, we'll see how this goes. But it's cool to see that we actually got access to something like that, which kind of makes me, you know, like, as the geek in me wants to know, did somebody on your team really get the 42U or 96U
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had a picture of it because it was pretty neat. I mean, it's
Nice.
almost a shame you don't go get to play with it. But you get whitelisted on your account and you get a role, and there you go. It'd be nice if you got an Outpost delivered though.
Right. Or, a snowball, something like that.
Yeah.
One of the, or let's just go like, hey, send us a snowmobile and we'll build a resource for it. Which, yeah, as a geek in me, I kind of want to find like a parking spot for that truck. Do I have that much data? Of course not. But that's not the point here, and we all know it. Beauty of infrastructure as code is that you can codify anything, even if you don't need it. And then you can terminate it. And because you only pay by the hour, usually, it's, totally fine. So we've got a couple more minutes. So if you want to get your questions in, definitely do it, because, now is a great moment to ask. I think user Amit, very happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us. If you're new to Terraform, not just Amit, but others as well, I definitely recommend checking out our Learn site at learn.hashicorp.com. And we've got a ton of tutorials on there for all of our products, but specifically for Terraform and the AWS providers. We've got a getting started guide. So if you want to learn how to set up your first EC2 instance, how to set up an S3 bucket, and do that while learning how to use Terraform, definitely check out these tutorials. Super good stuff. And same story, like if you find something in there that's not entirely right, give us a shout and we'll make sure it's fixed so you have a better experience. That actually makes me wonder, have you two figured out yet what your sessions are going to be for HashiCorp?
My sessions?
Oh, what are you looking for the most? Have you had a chance to look at the schedule?
I have not, unfortunately. This has been a crazy couple of weeks with the releases.
I can 100% believe that. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff happening. If you're on that level where you're thinking about contributing to Terraform, and you're good with Go, but you have no idea how the Terraform SDK works, we actually have a workshop for that. I want to give that one a shout out because, well, we talked about it in the SDK office hours earlier today, but I also had a chance to TA it last year, and it was such a good experience. It's 5 students per teaching assistant. So if you have questions, your question will get answered. So if you're thinking about doing that, definitely check out the workshops on the HashiCorp site. And, maybe we'll see you in one of those.
I can confirm. I went to some of those workshops at a previous HashiCorp before I worked at HashiCorp. So.
Nice. There's just the education team just puts so much thought into building those and making sure they are valuable. Because at the end of the day, if you're donating 90 minutes of your time or 3 hours, that's a huge commitment. And we want to make sure it's valuable for you and leaves you with a feeling of like, hey, that was great. And I learned something. So I'm curious, what is something that you came across, Angie, when implementing, any kind of service in Terraform for the AWS provider that makes you go like, hey, as a user, you should never do this? And I'm putting you on the spot here. So if you don't have like a service that comes to mind that you go like, if you do this, your bill is gonna, jump sky high.
This might be very trivial, but I think, what is it, like your instance class and stuff like that? I would definitely read up on what they map out to, like cache wise. That's something I think when I first started using, just like, what is it, a simple instance or a DB instance, an RDS. I would say be careful, because I'm pretty sure that, depending on which one you choose, you're in a different money range. And I think once you choose, it's kind of, I mean, you can always go back, right? The infrastructure isn't necessarily immutable, but yeah, I think that would be one thing to avoid, and maybe make sure you read up on before you click that apply button in the terminal. Trying to think if there are other good, like those seem kind of trivial, but I think sometimes reading up on what your infrastructure really means in AWS is important. Yeah, I can think of that right now off the top of my head. Maybe Simon has another example from personal experience.
I just think, like you said, the choice of instance type is important, but particularly when you're dealing with things like global clusters and replication groups. It's not just one thing you're specifying; it can be a lot of things, and that adds up very, very quickly. Just make sure you're not using your credit card.
I think, yeah, that is definitely the best start. One thing that I'm really happy about getting included into Terraform, so not specific to AWS, the AWS provider, is variable validation. So while the provider supports T1 through M4 X large and many more expensive instances, you could actually set your instance class variable with validation to be only 3 specific values. Maybe you only want the T2 range. So your instance class has to start with that. And the beautiful thing about that is that Terraform will not even make the API call because it realizes that your variable is set to the wrong thing. So in terms of code quality, that's a huge thing. Because if you know that you're building throwaway instances that all you want to do is they should start up, they execute a script, and you're not using something like Apprunner or something else that could do the same thing, they should be cheap, right? They should be disposable. Put that into your variables and your code will fail early, which is always the best part. I think it's a great shout out to read up on instance classes, because you might come across a tutorial that says, hey, you know what, just put this in there and it says, quadruple X large. Yeah, your instance is going to be super fast, but your billing status is also going to be peaking very quickly.
And there's you can do this at the Terraform level, but just having the right SCPs and guardrails in place to make sure you're not spinning up crazy instances in dev environments is pretty sensible too.
Yes, definitely good to keep that in mind. I think one of our ambassadors mentioned it this way: a badly set up development environment that impedes progress is just as critical as a production bug. Because if you're not able to create value during a sprint, why are you even doing the sprint? Like, you're wasting time and usually getting frustrated. Which, we don't want that. That being said, what was definitely not frustrating was our first office hours together. Thank you two for joining me. Any closing words?
Thank you, Kerim and audience, for listening.
Happy anniversary, Kerim.
Thank you. It's been a fun year. I think most of the office hours I've had was actually with the AWS team, so this fits perfectly with the tradition. We'll be back next Thursday because if you've been listening to us a little bit, then we call it the Terraform Thursday, which is almost as cool as Taco Tuesday, but it's different. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing questions, and we'll see you sometime soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.